Take your useless girls out of here. Girl children are a big liability.
Come on, let's go, baby.
These flowers are as beautiful as you two.
They're so pretty.
This one is for you.
Thank you.
Welcome to Luxurious Tales. If you love powerful stories, don't forget to like, share, and comment.
Please subscribe to our channel.
Yes, please subscribe. We would really appreciate your support.
Thank you.
Mireille Hart's earliest memories were made of sunlight, damp soil, and the patient voice of her grandmother, Estelle, who believed flowers could teach a child almost everything worth knowing about life. Their modest home stood on a quiet street in a small American town where winters pressed frost against the windows and spring arrived like a secret slowly being trusted again. Behind the house stretched a sprawling garden that seemed almost enchanted to young Mireille, not because it was perfect, but because it was always changing. Estelle moved through it with a woven basket on one arm and a pruning knife in the other, naming each flower as if she were introducing family members: peonies for tenderness, lavender for calm, marigolds for endurance, white camellias for dignity. Mireille listened with solemn wonder, her little fingers stained with earth as she copied every motion. Her father, Lucien Hart, repaired antique clocks in a workshop lined with tiny gears and quiet concentration, teaching her that broken things were not worthless just because they no longer moved. Her mother, Sabine Hart, taught literature at the local high school and filled the house with poetry, second-hand books, and the kind of conversations that made even ordinary evenings feel meaningful. In that home, nothing flashy was worshipped. Time, care, and thoughtfulness were the true currency. Mireille grew up learning that beauty was not vanity, gentleness was not weakness, and a home became sacred when people inside it chose kindness again and again. Even as a child, she arranged fallen petals in jars, tied little bunches of herbs with string, and whispered promises to wilted stems as if recovery were a language they both understood. When Estelle fell ill and the garden bloomed without her for the first time, Mireille stood among the roses with tears on her face and learned her first adult lesson too early: beautiful things could still break your heart, and loving them was still worth it. Across town, in a house far grander and colder, another child was growing beneath very different rules. Gideon Rowe's world was polished wood, long dining tables, family portraits that looked more like warnings than memories, and a father whose approval always seemed visible from a distance yet impossible to touch. Roland Rowe ran his household the way he ran his businesses, with precision, authority, and the expectation that everyone should know their place without being told twice. He spoke often of lineage, legacy, and the sacred burden of preserving the Rowe name, as though the family were not made of breathing people but carved from iron and expectation. To Gideon, still a boy with clever eyes and a hunger he did not know how to name, these speeches sounded like destiny. To Brenna, his younger sister, they sounded like a cage. She noticed what her brother did not yet have the freedom to see, that their father only seemed most alive when speaking about control, inheritance, and sons. Their mother, Colette, moved like a beautifully dressed ghost through those rooms, elegant and quiet, with music buried somewhere deep inside her. Before marriage, she had been a pianist with a future that shimmered brightly enough to make people travel just to hear her play. In the Rowe home, however, her talent had long ago been folded into silence, her opinions softened into caution, her disappointments hidden behind grace. Young Gideon adored her, but even then he was already being pulled away from softness and toward performance. He learned to sit straight, speak less, win often, and never reveal uncertainty. Roland praised toughness in him, dismissed emotion in Brenna, and treated Colette's silence as proof of order. Though the Harts and the Rowes lived under the same sky, the distance between their lives was vast. One home taught a child to nurture life. The other taught a child to conquer it. Neither Mireille nor Gideon knew it yet, but those lessons would one day collide with devastating force. As Mireille grew into adolescence, her sensitivity ripened into talent rather than shrinking into fragility. At school, she became known not as the loudest girl in the room, but as the one who could make any dull space feel alive. She transformed classroom corners with seasonal arrangements, designed prom flowers that made even cynical teachers emotional, and volunteered at hospitals where she learned that a small bouquet placed near a weary patient could shift the air in a room. Her best friend, Tamsin Vale, met her during those years and loved her instantly for her odd combination of softness and steel. Tamsin was witty, artistic, and impossible to intimidate, already sculpting clay with a fierce imagination while Mireille built entire moods out of flowers and color. Together they dreamed in practical details, not fantasy alone. Tamsin wanted to create objects that held memory, Mireille wanted to design gardens, courtyards, and spaces where people who felt bruised by life could breathe again. Sabine encouraged those dreams, Lucien quietly saved money for college, and even after Estelle's death, Mireille continued tending the old garden as if grief itself could be composted into beauty. By the time she entered college to study floral design and landscape aesthetics, she had become the sort of young woman people trusted with fragile things. She listened carefully, noticed what others ignored, and carried herself with a warmth that drew stories out of strangers. At the same time, Gideon was becoming a very different kind of young adult. Handsome, disciplined, and increasingly admired, he learned how to command attention in lecture halls, impress investors in training programs, and wear ambition like custom tailoring. People called him promising, brilliant, inevitable. Roland called him almost ready, which somehow sounded less like praise than another challenge. Brenna watched her brother harden into the shape their father preferred and feared what it would cost him. Colette watched too, saying little, her silence growing heavier with each passing year. As Mireille's world bloomed wider through creativity and empathy, Gideon's narrowed around achievement and the hunger to become undeniable. Their lives moved on separate tracks toward adulthood, one rooted in healing, the other in inheritance. Somewhere ahead waited a winter conservatory filled with glass, orchids, and warm lights where those two lives would finally meet, but for now the story belonged to the girl who grew among flowers and learned, long before love tested her, that survival was sometimes another word for blooming. Gideon Rowe had been raised inside a mansion where excellence was expected and affection was rationed so carefully it felt more like a reward than a birthright. From the time he was old enough to sit upright at Roland Rowe's dining table without fidgeting, he was taught that men were remembered by what they built, what they controlled, and most of all by the sons who carried their names forward. Roland never shouted without reason, he was far more dangerous than that. He corrected with precision, disappointment, and the kind of cold restraint that made everyone else in the room feel smaller. Gideon learned to chase approval the way starving men chased bread. He excelled in school, in debate, in athletics, and in every polished environment where achievement could be measured and displayed, yet none of it ever seemed enough to soften his father's face for long. Roland spoke of tenderness as if it were a defect, mocked sentiment as weakness, and treated legacy like a religion. Gideon absorbed every lesson because children often mistake survival for agreement. He began to believe that a man's worth depended on becoming unshakable, admired, and impossible to replace. Beneath the confidence he would later wear so well, a quieter truth was growing. He was frightened of failing a standard he had never chosen. When he visited boarding schools, internship programs, and polished city offices as he got older, people saw discipline and charm. They did not see the boy still measuring every success against the father who could look at triumph and ask why it was not greater. Gideon was not cruel then, not yet, but he was already being shaped into someone who thought love had to justify itself through usefulness, and family had to prove its value through legacy. Roland's hunger had not started with Gideon, it came from older humiliations he carried like hidden scars. In his youth, he had grown up adjacent to wealth but not securely inside it, always close enough to taste power and distant enough to fear losing it. He learned early that old money circles respected bloodlines, succession, and the appearance of permanence more than warmth or decency. By the time he built the Rowe name into something formidable, he had fused success with obsession. He could not bear the thought of being forgotten, diluted, or outlived by irrelevance. Colette, who might once have softened him, instead became one more sacrifice laid at the altar of his ambition. Before marriage, she had been luminous, a gifted pianist with invitations to perform abroad and a laugh that made people turn their heads without knowing why. But marriage into the Rowe dynasty had slowly turned her gifts inward. Her piano remained polished, rarely touched, and the woman who might have filled concert halls learned instead to fill silence. Brenna, unlike Gideon, saw all this with painful clarity. As a girl she noticed how often her father praised strength only when it appeared in men, and how quickly he dismissed women even when they were the ones holding entire households together. While Gideon trained himself to win, Brenna trained herself to observe. She began keeping private notebooks, recording odd remarks, dates, inconsistencies in family stories, and changes in her mother's face whenever old subjects surfaced. No one knew that the quiet daughter in the corner was becoming the family's most dangerous witness. In that house, Gideon inherited hunger, Brenna inherited suspicion, and Colette carried memory like a sealed wound. By early adulthood, Gideon had become the kind of man people described with certainty before they knew him at all. He moved through elite rooms with ease, understood how to read a boardroom, and possessed the polished intelligence that made older businessmen lean in and younger ones imitate his mannerisms. He built momentum quickly, attracting mentors, opportunities, and the reputation of a man destined for influence. Yet there were fractures beneath the surface even then. He wanted admiration not simply because it felt good, but because it quieted something frantic inside him. He pursued success with the rigid focus of someone trying to outrun a sentence he had never heard spoken aloud. Silas Vane, who entered his world during these rising years, recognized that hunger immediately and fed it with flattery disguised as friendship. Silas admired Gideon's discipline, praised his instincts, and often joked that with enough power a man could fix every weakness in his life before anyone saw it. Gideon laughed, but he listened. Colette watched her son become more polished and less reachable. Brenna watched him become more like Roland in posture and timing, and the way silence could harden around him when challenged. Only rarely did Gideon let himself show uncertainty, and when he did, it was brief and buried quickly. He wanted love, though he did not yet understand how to receive it without turning it into another structure he could control. He wanted family too, but in a form approved by the mythology that had raised him. Long before he met Mireille beneath warm greenhouse light, the roots of his future tragedy were already deep in him. He had inherited ambition, discipline, and access, but alongside them he had inherited a famine of the heart, a dangerous belief that legacy mattered more than tenderness. That belief did not yet rule him completely, but it was there, waiting patiently for the right moment to demand everything. Winter had settled softly over the city the night Mireille stepped into the grand conservatory where the charity gala was being held. The enormous glass building glowed against the snow like a lantern filled with living color. Inside, orchids hung from delicate arches, roses curled along golden frames, and rare lilies breathed perfume into the warm air. Mireille moved carefully between her arrangements, adjusting a branch here and misting petals there, making sure every detail looked alive rather than staged. While elegantly dressed guests admired the displays, very few realized that the young woman quietly tending the flowers had designed the entire atmosphere herself. Her calm focus gave her a quiet presence that contrasted sharply with the rehearsed charm of the wealthy crowd. Gideon Rowe arrived late that evening, his entrance announced by murmurs among business partners who recognized the promising young executive already making waves in powerful circles. Dressed in a sharply tailored suit, Gideon carried the polished confidence people expected from him, yet something about the conservatory unsettled him in a strange way. The scent of fresh soil and flowers felt honest compared to the rigid boardrooms he spent most of his time in. As he walked through the displays, he noticed Mireille standing on a small ladder, carefully repositioning a cascade of white orchids that had begun to lean too heavily toward the glass wall. She did not seem concerned with impressing anyone, her entire attention rested on restoring the arrangement's natural balance. That quiet dedication caught Gideon's attention far more than the glittering guests around him. Their first conversation was simple and unexpected. Gideon asked a question about the orchids, admitting he knew nothing about flowers but was curious why some seemed delicate while others appeared almost stubbornly strong. Mireille smiled gently and explained that many flowers survived harsh winters underground before blooming again, which meant their softness was often misleading. The conversation lingered longer than either of them expected, stretching past polite introductions into something more thoughtful. Gideon found himself speaking more honestly than he usually allowed in public, while Mireille sensed a quiet loneliness behind his polished demeanor. Across the room, Tamsin Vale observed the exchange with cautious interest, and Brenna Rowe, who had arrived briefly with her brother, watched Mireille with approval. In that glowing greenhouse filled with fragile beauty, two lives shaped by entirely different worlds had just begun a connection neither of them yet understood. After the night at the conservatory, Gideon found himself thinking about Mireille more often than he expected. It began with small excuses to return to the floral studio where she worked. Sometimes he claimed he needed arrangements for corporate meetings. Other times he simply arrived with questions about plants he pretended not to understand. Mireille noticed the pattern but never mocked it. Instead, she welcomed the conversations, explaining how flowers responded to seasons, light, and patience. To Gideon's surprise, those visits became the calmest moments of his week. Their connection deepened slowly, built through shared walks, thoughtful conversations, and quiet laughter that surprised them both. Gideon spoke about ambition and the pressure he carried from his family name, while Mireille spoke about beauty, growth, and the strange comfort she found in nurturing fragile things. Tamsin, ever protective, watched Gideon carefully but admitted that he seemed different around Mireille, less polished, more human. Brenna also warmed to Mireille quickly, sensing sincerity in her kindness. Even Colette, during one brief meeting, studied Mireille with quiet approval, as though recognizing a rare gentleness that had long been missing from the Rowe household. Within a year, Gideon proposed during a quiet evening in Mireille's childhood garden, surrounded by the very roses her grandmother once tended. The proposal was not extravagant but sincere, and Mireille accepted with hopeful certainty that their love could build something warmer than the rigid home Gideon had known. Their wedding followed in early spring, filled with music, laughter, and an ocean of flowers Mireille designed herself. Rowe attended with formal dignity, praising the union as a respectable alliance, though his words always circled back to legacy and family name. Still, in those early months of marriage, Gideon and Mireille believed they were building a life shaped by love rather than expectation, unaware of the storms slowly forming beneath the surface of those promises. The first months of marriage felt like a carefully painted season of peace. Mireille worked tirelessly to turn the Rowe mansion into a living home rather than a polished monument. She filled long hallways with fresh flowers, opened curtains to let morning sunlight spill across the marble floors, and placed small herb gardens near the kitchen windows. Gideon watched these changes with quiet fascination, often admitting that the house had never felt warm before she arrived. In the evenings they shared simple routines, cooking together, walking through the garden paths, and discussing dreams about children and future plans. For a time, it seemed as though Mireille's gentle influence might soften the rigid atmosphere Gideon had grown up in. Yet beneath the comfort, subtle tensions began to appear. Rowe visited more frequently than before, always with polite smiles that had carefully measured expectations. During dinners he spoke about the importance of family legacy and the responsibility of carrying the Rowe name into the next generation. Mireille initially dismissed those conversations as harmless traditions of an older man who valued heritage, but Gideon listened with deeper attention. The words echoed in his mind long after Roland left, quietly reminding him of the standards he had been raised to fulfill. Outside the mansion, life around them continued unfolding with its own challenges. Tamsin struggled with rising rent at her ceramic studio and often confided in Mireille about the fear of losing the small business she had built with so much effort. Brenna, meanwhile, spent long nights reviewing complicated financial documents connected to the Rowe Company's legacy trusts. Something about them felt inconsistent, though she could not yet explain why. Silas Vane also became a regular presence in Gideon's world, frequently inviting him to exclusive meetings and celebrations where success was measured by power and reputation. Silas admired Gideon's ambition and often encouraged him to think bigger, speak louder, and demand more from life. Mireille noticed the subtle change in Gideon whenever he returned from those gatherings. He became more distant, more focused on status and long-term inheritance. Though he still loved her, the weight of expectation slowly crept back into his thoughts, like a shadow quietly reclaiming space in a once bright room. The tension grew clearer when Mireille discovered she was pregnant with their first child. Her joy was immediate and overwhelming. She spent hours writing in a journal, planting new flowers in the garden, and imagining the tiny life growing inside her. Gideon was excited as well, holding her hands with a rare softness that reminded her of the man she had first met in the conservatory. Yet even in those tender moments, questions began slipping into his voice. He wondered aloud what kind of child they would have, whether the baby would resemble him, and eventually whether it might be a boy. Mireille laughed gently, telling him that love mattered more than expectations, but Roland's influence had already planted its seeds. One evening during a formal family dinner, Roland raised a glass and remarked that a strong household always began with a firstborn son to steady its future. Mireille smiled politely, trying to brush away the remark, but something about Gideon's thoughtful silence unsettled her. For the first time since their marriage began, she sensed that the peaceful life they were building might not be strong enough to withstand the beliefs buried deep within the Rowe family legacy. The night Mireille went into labor arrived during a quiet autumn rain that tapped gently against the tall windows of the Rowe mansion. Gideon rushed her to the hospital with an urgency that surprised even himself, gripping the steering wheel tightly as though he could drive away every uncertainty that had been building inside him. Hours later, when the doctor finally placed the newborn into Mireille's trembling arms, she felt the world shift in a way that no words could capture. The tiny girl blinked softly beneath the bright hospital lights, her fragile fingers curling around Mireille's thumb as if recognizing warmth already. They named her Cecily Rowe, a name Mireille had quietly loved for months. In that moment, nothing else mattered to her except the child's steady breathing and the overwhelming realization that she would protect this life with every ounce of strength she possessed. Gideon stood beside the hospital bed watching silently. For a brief moment, genuine tenderness softened his expression as he touched Cecily's cheek and whispered her name, marveling at how impossibly small and perfect she looked. Yet when Roland later arrived at the hospital room and learned that the child was a girl, the room's atmosphere subtly shifted. Roland offered polite congratulations, but his smile carried a restrained disappointment that Mireille could not ignore. During Cecily's early months, the mansion transformed in ways both joyful and complicated. Mireille decorated the nursery with soft pastel flowers and hand-stitched blankets, filling the space with gentle music and warm light. Cecily quickly revealed a lively personality, responding to colors, laughter, and the scent of flowers her mother often carried into the room. Gideon surprised everyone at first by becoming an attentive father. He spent evenings rocking Cecily in his arms, reading picture books, and walking through the garden with the baby nestled against his chest. Mireille felt hopeful watching those moments unfold. She believed fatherhood might be slowly softening the rigid expectations that had once troubled her. But Roland's influence never disappeared entirely. During family gatherings he occasionally made subtle remarks about future heirs and the importance of continuing the Rowe name through sons. These comments were often disguised as harmless jokes, yet they lingered in the air long after the laughter faded. Brenna noticed the tension immediately and often changed the subject, while Colette quietly watched her granddaughter with a tenderness that suggested both pride and regret. As Cecily grew into her second year, she became a curious and imaginative child who adored drawing pictures of houses filled with windows and gardens. She followed Mireille through the mansion's courtyard, asking questions about every flower she saw and trying to pronounce their names with determined concentration. Mireille cherished these small adventures, believing they were building a childhood filled with love and discovery. Gideon still cared deeply for Cecily, but the subtle pressure around him continued growing stronger. Silas often joked during business dinners that powerful men eventually needed sons to inherit their empires, and Roland rarely missed an opportunity to remind Gideon of his responsibilities. One evening Gideon stood quietly outside Cecily's nursery while Mireille sang a lullaby inside. The sight of his daughter sleeping peacefully stirred both affection and an uncomfortable sense of expectation he could not explain. He loved the child deeply, yet somewhere inside him a poisonous idea had begun taking root, the belief that this beautiful daughter, for all her innocence, might not be enough to satisfy the legacy his father demanded. As the years passed, the Rowe mansion settled into a rhythm that appeared peaceful to outsiders but slowly shifted beneath the surface. Mireille devoted herself to raising Cecily with the same patience and warmth she had known in her childhood garden. The little girl filled the house with curiosity, often sitting beside her mother while learning the names of flowers or drawing colorful pictures across sheets of paper. Mireille continued accepting occasional floral design projects, bringing life into elegant events and small city spaces where her talent quietly earned admiration. Gideon's business career, meanwhile, expanded rapidly. Investors praised his discipline, and powerful partners treated him as a rising figure in their circles. Yet success came with a sharper edge. Gideon began to value appearances more than before, insisting the household run with a kind of polished order that mirrored his professional world. While he still loved Cecily and respected Mireille, the warmth he once showed so easily grew more guarded, as though ambition were slowly tightening around his personality. Outside the mansion, other lives unfolded in ways that continued shaping the story. Tamsin fought fiercely to keep her ceramic studio alive as rent prices climbed and competition increased. Her determination only strengthened her friendship with Mireille, who often visited the studio with Cecily, turning quiet afternoons into small adventures of clay, color, and laughter. Brenna, meanwhile, was becoming known for her sharp mind within financial compliance circles. She often worked late nights studying complicated documents and regulatory systems, though something about the Rowe family's older records continued to bother her. She could not yet define the problem, but instinct told her the family's celebrated legacy might contain secrets hidden beneath carefully preserved reputations. Colette, watching her granddaughter grow, found moments of joy she had not experienced in years. She often read stories to Cecily in the evenings, smiling softly as the child asked endless questions about music, flowers, and the world beyond the mansion's walls. Despite these tender moments, pressure slowly returned to the center of Gideon's life. Roland began raising the subject of heirs more openly, speaking about lineage during formal dinners and reminding Gideon that great families survived through sons who continued the name. These conversations were rarely arguments, they were calm, deliberate reminders delivered with quiet authority. Gideon rarely challenged his father, though the remarks clearly lingered in his thoughts. Mireille sensed the shift and tried to focus on the happiness already present in their lives. Still, when Gideon eventually mentioned the possibility of trying for another child, his tone carried an expectation she could not ignore. She wanted another baby because she loved motherhood, yet she feared the growing belief that their family would only be complete if a son arrived. As winter approached and the garden outside the mansion rested beneath frost, Mireille stood beside Cecily watching snow fall across the quiet courtyard, silently hoping that love alone would remain strong enough to protect their home from the dangerous expectations slowly gathering around it. When Mireille discovered she was pregnant again, the news arrived on a quiet morning when Cecily was drawing colorful flowers across the kitchen table. The moment should have felt like pure joy, and in many ways it did. Mireille's heart swelled with the thought of another child joining their family. She imagined Cecily holding a baby sibling, imagined laughter filling the house again, imagined the nursery blooming with gentle colors. Gideon reacted with excitement as well, embracing her warmly and speaking about expanding their family. Yet as the days passed, Mireille noticed something subtle in his enthusiasm. When he spoke about the baby, his questions often circled around the same hope, the same expectation he rarely said directly but implied through tone and expression. Roland's influence lingered in those conversations like an invisible weight pressing quietly against the future. As Mireille's pregnancy progressed, the Rowe household once again became a stage for expectations disguised as tradition. Roland began visiting more frequently, bringing antique gifts and speaking about the continuation of the family line with growing intensity. At formal dinners he would raise his glass and speak about legacy, inheritance, and the importance of sons carrying forward powerful names. Gideon listened carefully during these speeches, though he never openly challenged them. Colette noticed Mireille's growing discomfort and often tried to soften the atmosphere by changing the subject or asking gentle questions about the baby's health. Meanwhile, Brenna continued her quiet investigations into old family records, occasionally pausing her work to observe the tension building inside the household. She sensed something fragile in the way Gideon now discussed the future, as though he were trying to satisfy expectations he had never truly chosen for himself. The tension reached a quiet but unsettling moment during a formal dinner Roland hosted to celebrate the pregnancy. The grand dining hall was filled with polished silver, soft candlelight, and guests who admired the Rowe name as a symbol of power. Roland stood at the head of the table and gave a long speech about heritage and responsibility, praising Gideon for continuing the family legacy. His words were carefully chosen, yet every sentence seemed to circle one idea: the arrival of a male heir would secure the Rowe name for generations. Mireille sat silently beside Gideon, feeling less like a mother and more like a vessel being judged for what she might deliver. Gideon said nothing to challenge his father's remarks, and that silence lingered heavier than any spoken word. Later that night, as Mireille stood alone in the quiet nursery watching Cecily sleep, she felt an uneasy realization settle inside her heart. The joy of bringing another child into the world had become entangled with expectations that threatened to overshadow love itself. As Mireille's pregnancy moved into its later months, the mansion became quieter in ways that felt uneasy rather than peaceful. Mireille spent much of her time preparing the nursery again, arranging flowers on the windowsill and carefully folding tiny clothes into drawers. Cecily often followed her around, asking innocent questions about when the baby would arrive and whether she could help take care of it. Mireille smiled warmly at her daughter's excitement, though inside she carried a growing anxiety she could not easily explain. Gideon had become more distant, often distracted by business calls and long meetings that stretched late into the night. When he did speak about the baby, his tone carried the same expectation Roland had planted months earlier. Mireille tried to push those worries aside, reminding herself that love had built their family and love would protect it. While Mireille focused on preparing for motherhood again, Brenna's curiosity about the Rowe family records grew stronger. Late nights found her sitting alone in her apartment surrounded by stacks of old documents and legal files connected to the family's business empire. Something about the records bothered her deeply, though the pattern remained just beyond her understanding. Dates did not always match, and certain hospital documents had been sealed under unusual legal restrictions. Brenna had learned long ago to trust her instincts, and those instincts told her the Rowe family's proud history might hide truths no one had ever dared to question. Meanwhile, Tamsin continued supporting Mireille through frequent visits, bringing laughter and small handmade ceramic gifts for the baby. She could sense the tension growing around Gideon and Roland, and although she tried not to interfere directly, she remained watchful, unwilling to let her friend face those pressures alone. The final weeks of pregnancy arrived beneath heavy storm clouds that seemed to mirror the tension inside the Rowe household. One evening the wind rattled the tall windows of the mansion while Mireille sat quietly in the nursery writing a letter to the unborn baby. She wrote about hope, about love, and about the promise that no matter what happened, the child would always be cherished. Cecily had already fallen asleep in the next room, clutching one of her drawings meant for her future sibling. Downstairs Gideon argued softly on the phone with Silas about an urgent business deal, his voice tense and distracted. Roland sat in the library reading financial reports as though nothing in the house mattered except the empire he had spent decades building. Later that night, as thunder rolled across the sky, Mireille felt the first sharp pain of labor. The moment had arrived sooner than expected, and as Gideon hurried her toward the hospital through the dark, storm-filled streets, neither of them realized that the child about to be born would soon change the fate of their family forever. The storm had not quieted when Mireille arrived at the hospital. Rain streaked the windows while nurses moved swiftly through the softly lit maternity ward. Gideon paced the corridor outside the delivery room, checking his phone repeatedly and answering occasional business messages, though his thoughts were clearly elsewhere. Inside, Mireille endured the long, exhausting hours of labor with determined strength, remembering her grandmother's words about endurance and life pushing through difficult seasons. When the doctor finally lifted the newborn and announced the baby's arrival, Mireille's heart surged with relief and overwhelming love. The child cried loudly, healthy and full of life, and when the nurse gently placed the baby in Mireille's arms, tears streamed down her face. The baby girl blinked slowly at the bright lights as though greeting the world with quiet curiosity. Mireille whispered softly, "Odette," the name she had chosen weeks earlier. To her, the baby was perfect. Cecily was brought in later that morning by Colette, who held the older child's hand carefully as they entered the hospital room. Cecily stared in amazement at the tiny bundle wrapped in blankets, her eyes shining with excitement. She carefully touched her baby sister's hand and giggled when Odette's fingers curled around hers. The moment felt tender and hopeful, and even Gideon seemed briefly moved as he watched the two sisters together. Yet the atmosphere changed subtly when Roland arrived a short while later. He stood near the foot of the hospital bed, examining the newborn with a controlled expression. His congratulations sounded formal rather than joyful, and his voice carried a faint disappointment that Mireille could not ignore. Gideon's face hardened slightly after Roland's brief remarks, as though a silent judgment had been passed. Later that evening the hospital room grew quiet as visitors gradually left. Tamsin sent a message filled with excitement and promises to visit soon, while Brenna stopped by briefly, noticing the tension that hung awkwardly in the air. She congratulated Mireille warmly and held Odette gently, though her eyes shifted thoughtfully toward Gideon, who remained distant near the window. Mireille watched him carefully, sensing the change she had feared during the pregnancy. Instead of celebrating, Gideon seemed withdrawn, speaking little and avoiding the baby's gaze. The realization cut deeply into Mireille's heart. As night settled and the hospital corridor lights dimmed, she held Odette close and listened to the quiet breathing of both daughters beside her. A painful understanding began to settle in her mind. The child she loved so fiercely had already become the center of a conflict that might soon tear their family apart. When Mireille and the newborn finally returned home, the Rowe mansion felt strangely colder than it had before the birth. The grand hallways that once carried the scent of flowers now seemed filled with a quiet tension that no arrangement of roses could soften. Mireille focused on caring for Odette and Cecily, waking through long nights to feed the baby and comfort her when she cried. Cecily tried to help in small ways, bringing her mother blankets or whispering gentle greetings to her sister. Yet Gideon's behavior began shifting in ways that Mireille could no longer ignore. He spent more hours away from the house, often claiming urgent business matters required his attention. When he returned home, he rarely held Odette or asked about her well-being. His distance was not loud or dramatic, it was quieter, more painful, like a slow withdrawal of warmth from a once loving home. Roland's presence only deepened the growing hostility. He visited often under the pretense of checking on the family but never once showed genuine affection toward the newborn. Instead, his conversations with Gideon grew increasingly direct about the future of the Rowe name. Mireille overheard fragments of their discussions in the library, phrases about responsibility, continuation of bloodline, and the importance of correcting mistakes before they became permanent. Those words pierced her deeply, yet she forced herself to remain calm for the sake of her daughters. Brenna noticed the shift during one of her visits and confronted Gideon privately, warning him that he was letting their father poison his judgment. Gideon dismissed her concerns sharply, claiming she did not understand the pressures placed on him. Colette, watching the family from the sidelines, seemed more troubled than ever, her usual silence filled with a sadness she could no longer hide. The breaking point began forming during a tense family dinner several weeks later. Roland raised his glass and spoke again about the legacy of the Rowe family, remarking that great dynasties required strong heirs who would carry forward their name and power. His tone implied that daughters alone could not fulfill that expectation. Mireille finally gathered the courage to respond calmly, reminding him that every child deserved love and dignity regardless of gender. The room fell silent after her words. Gideon sat motionless beside her, saying nothing in her defense, his silence echoing louder than Roland's criticism. That moment revealed the truth Mireille had been trying to avoid. The home she had worked so hard to nurture was no longer safe for her daughters. As the dinner ended and the house returned to its heavy quiet, Mireille sensed that the fragile thread holding her marriage together was about to snap completely. The confrontation that shattered everything began on a bitter evening when the mansion felt unusually tense even before a single word was spoken. Gideon had returned from a long meeting with Silas, his expression hardened by frustration and the pressure that had been building for months. Mireille was in the nursery rocking Odette gently while Cecily sat beside her drawing flowers in a small notebook. When Gideon entered the room, the quiet calm of the nursery seemed to irritate him rather than comfort him. His voice carried a sharp edge as he began speaking about expectations, responsibilities, and the future of the Rowe name. Mireille tried to remain calm, reminding him that their daughters were healthy, beautiful children who deserved love. But Gideon's anger had been quietly accumulating under Roland's constant influence, and now it erupted in words that cut deeper than Mireille had imagined possible. He spoke bitterly about legacy and disappointment, accusing her of failing to give him the son his family expected. The argument moved downstairs into the main living hall, where the high ceilings echoed with every painful sentence. Cecily clutched Mireille's hand tightly, confused and frightened by the anger she had never witnessed before. Gideon's frustration grew louder as he repeated the same cruel belief Roland had planted in him for years, that daughters could never carry the Rowe legacy. Mireille stood firmly despite the shock in her chest, refusing to accept the humiliation quietly. She reminded him that love and responsibility defined a father, not the gender of a child. But Gideon, blinded by pride and pressure, refused to listen. With a cold finality that stunned even himself, he told Mireille to leave the house with the girls. The words felt unreal as they echoed through the grand hall. Cecily began crying softly while Mireille stood frozen for a moment, trying to understand how the man she once loved had become someone capable of such cruelty. Within an hour, Mireille gathered what little she could carry. A single suitcase held a few clothes, important documents, and the small packet of flower seeds she had kept since her grandmother's garden. She wrapped Odette carefully in a blanket and held Cecily's trembling hand as they stepped outside into the freezing night. The large iron gates of the Rowe mansion closed behind them with a heavy final sound that felt like the end of an entire chapter of her life. Tamsin, who had received Mireille's desperate message, quickly arranged a ride to the old boarding house owned by June Mercer. The building looked worn and simple compared to the mansion they had just left, but its warm lights offered something the mansion had lost long ago: kindness. June opened the door without hesitation, welcoming them inside with calm understanding. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Gideon stood alone in the silent hall, convinced he had protected his legacy, not yet realizing that in that moment he had thrown away the only family that truly mattered. The boarding house owned by June Mercer stood on a quiet corner of an older neighborhood where streetlights glowed softly through tall maple trees. The building itself was weathered but welcoming, with creaking wooden floors and a wide porch that carried the scent of tea and old books. When Mireille stepped inside with Cecily and the newborn Odette, she felt both exhaustion and relief wash over her at once. June Mercer, a woman whose calm eyes had witnessed many difficult stories over the years, guided them gently inside without asking painful questions. She prepared a small room for them with fresh blankets and warm soup, offering comfort through quiet kindness rather than curiosity. Cecily slowly relaxed as the warmth of the house replaced the cold night outside, while Mireille sat silently holding Odette, still trying to process how quickly her life had changed. Over the next few days, Mireille began to notice that the boarding house was more than just a temporary shelter. It was home to several women who had each survived their own difficult journeys. There was Helena Ward, a violin repairer who had rebuilt her life after leaving a troubled marriage. Doris Lane, a determined nursing student raising twin boys while studying through sleepless nights. Marta Klein, a seamstress who had lost her small shop in a fire but continued working from a corner room filled with fabric and patience. Each woman carried her own scars but also a quiet strength that filled the house with resilience rather than sadness. June Mercer had created a place where broken circumstances did not define a person's future. For the first time since leaving the Rowe mansion, Mireille began to breathe a little easier, realizing she was surrounded by people who understood hardship and still chose kindness. Meanwhile, life inside the Rowe mansion continued without warmth or celebration. Gideon buried himself in business meetings and financial strategies, refusing to acknowledge the emptiness left behind by his family's absence. Roland praised his decision with cold approval, convinced that Gideon had chosen strength over sentiment. Yet the mansion felt unusually silent even to the servants who worked there daily. Brenna had already cut off most contact with her brother, furious at the cruelty of his actions and increasingly suspicious of the family's buried secrets. Colette, unable to ignore her guilt any longer, quietly arranged for supplies and baby necessities to be delivered anonymously to June's boarding house. Back in that small warm room, Mireille began planting tiny flower seeds in a few borrowed pots by the window. It was a small act of hope, but it reminded her of the lessons her grandmother had once taught her, that even the most fragile seeds could survive harsh winters if they were given patience, light, and care. Life at June Mercer's boarding house slowly began to settle into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar but strangely comforting for Mireille. Each morning she woke early to feed Odette while Cecily helped June water the plants that grew along the small back garden. The yard had clearly once been beautiful, but years of neglect had left it patchy and dry. When Mireille knelt in the soil one afternoon, carefully loosening the hardened earth with borrowed tools, she felt something inside her awaken again. Gardening had always been more than a hobby, it had been the language through which she understood life itself. June noticed the quiet dedication and soon offered Mireille permission to restore the neglected garden however she wished. With Cecily happily assisting her, Mireille began planting small flowers, herbs, and climbing vines. The transformation happened slowly, but every new green shoot felt like a promise that life could grow again even in damaged places. Word of Mireille's talent began spreading quietly through the neighborhood. One afternoon the owner of a nearby cafe noticed the colorful garden outside the boarding house and asked if Mireille could design seasonal arrangements for the cafe's outdoor tables. The request seemed small, but it became the first step toward rebuilding her independence. Soon afterward a local wedding planner visited the cafe, admired Mireille's arrangements, and asked if she could help design floral displays for a small ceremony. With Tamsin eagerly offering help through her ceramic designs and artistic ideas, the two women began working together again like they had dreamed about years earlier. Meanwhile, Iris Hale, Mireille's sharp-minded cousin and a respected family lawyer, heard about the situation and contacted her immediately. Iris was furious that Mireille had endured such treatment without reaching out for help earlier, but her anger quickly turned into determination. She promised to examine the legal aspects of Gideon's actions carefully, making sure Mireille and her daughters would not be left vulnerable. Back at the Rowe mansion, however, cracks were beginning to appear within Gideon's carefully controlled world. Silas Vane had persuaded him to invest heavily in an aggressive financial venture that promised rapid growth, but recent reports suggested the deal might be far riskier than expected. Roland blamed Gideon's recent emotional distractions for the uncertainty, criticizing him for allowing personal matters to interfere with business judgment. The mansion felt colder than ever, its silent rooms reminding Gideon of the absence he tried not to acknowledge. Late at night he often walked past the empty nursery that had once belonged to Cecily and Odette, pausing briefly before forcing himself to continue down the dark hallway. Meanwhile, at the boarding house across town, Mireille received confirmation of her first independent contract for a large community courtyard restoration project. As she stood quietly in the garden holding the letter, Cecily excitedly dancing beside her, Mireille realized that the life she thought had been destroyed might instead be growing into something stronger than she had ever imagined. Brenna's suspicions about the Rowe family records had grown too strong to ignore, and she finally brought her findings to Iris Hale, whose legal expertise gave the puzzle new direction. Together they examined decades of sealed documents, hospital records, and financial arrangements hidden deep within the Rowe estate archives. The pattern slowly emerged through careful study and long nights of quiet investigation. Years ago, during a complicated medical crisis surrounding Gideon's birth, certain documents had been altered and sealed under legal confidentiality. Roland had ensured that the truth never surfaced publicly, protecting the Rowe reputation at all costs. What Brenna and Iris discovered shook them both. The foundation of Roland's obsession with pure male lineage was built on a lie that had been carefully hidden for decades. The family empire had been driven by pride and control, yet the very bloodline Roland worshipped so fiercely had never been as unquestionable as he claimed. The revelation spread through the family quietly but with explosive emotional consequences. Brenna confronted Colette first, gently but firmly presenting the documents she and Iris had uncovered. Colette's silence lasted for a long time before tears slowly formed in her eyes. She admitted that the truth had haunted her for years, but that Roland's influence and the fear of destroying the family had kept her from speaking out. The truth was devastating in its irony. Gideon himself had never been the unquestionable symbol of legacy Roland had built his authority upon. The patriarch's obsession with sons and bloodline had driven him to manipulate records, bury secrets, and create a mythology that shaped his children's lives. When Gideon eventually learned the truth through Brenna's confrontation, the information struck him like a storm collapsing years of belief. The legacy he had protected so fiercely, even at the cost of his own family, had never been as pure or certain as he had been taught. Across town at the boarding house, Mireille remained unaware of the full revelation unfolding inside the Rowe family, though she sensed that events beyond her control were shifting. Her focus remained on rebuilding a stable life for Cecily and Odette. The courtyard restoration project had begun attracting attention from local business owners and community organizers who admired her work. Flowers spread through the public space she was designing, transforming what had once been a neglected corner into a vibrant gathering place. Tamsin worked beside her, crafting ceramic planters that complemented the blooming arrangements. One evening as Mireille rocked Odette to sleep in the small room they now called home, she reflected on how much her life had changed. She no longer lived in fear of expectations tied to legacy or inheritance. Instead, she was building something genuine with her own hands. Meanwhile, far away in the silent halls of the Rowe mansion, Gideon sat alone with the documents Brenna had shown him, realizing with painful clarity that the very belief that drove him to abandon his daughters had been built on deception. Mireille's quiet determination slowly transformed into something far stronger than survival. The courtyard project she completed became a small sensation in the neighborhood, drawing visitors who admired the gentle beauty she created out of once-forgotten spaces. People began recommending her work for other locations: a clinic courtyard that needed calming greenery, a small school garden where children could learn about nature, and a community memorial park that required thoughtful restoration. With every new project, Mireille's confidence grew. She was no longer simply rebuilding her life, she was creating something meaningful that helped others find peace as well. Cecily often accompanied her, carrying small gardening tools and asking endless questions about flowers and soil. Even little Odette, now an energetic toddler, giggled happily while playing among the bright colors of the gardens. Watching her daughters grow surrounded by life and creativity reminded Mireille daily that the strength people once dismissed in her had always been her greatest gift. The greenhouse renovation project brought an important new figure into their lives. Rowan Beck, a horticulturist known for restoring damaged urban gardens, joined the project as a consultant. Unlike many professionals Mireille had met before, Rowan carried a quiet patience and respect for the natural world that instantly earned her trust. He often worked alongside her without unnecessary instructions, observing the soil, the plants, and the way she carefully balanced color and growth patterns. Rowan had his own past marked by loss. His wife had died years earlier, leaving him to raise his young son, Nora Beck, alone. Despite his grief, he had dedicated himself to nurturing plants and teaching others how growth could return even after difficult seasons. Cecily quickly became friends with Nora during visits to the greenhouse, the two children exploring flower beds and inventing imaginative stories about magical gardens. Rowan noticed Mireille's strength in raising her daughters alone and admired the calm courage with which she had rebuilt her life. Meanwhile, across the city, Gideon's carefully constructed world continued to unravel. Investors had begun questioning the financial stability of the venture Silas Vane had convinced him to pursue, and rumors about the hidden family records were slowly spreading among powerful circles. Roland's health had also begun declining, weakening the authority he once used to control every decision within the family. Brenna, no longer willing to protect the lies surrounding the Rowe name, refused to cover for her father's past manipulations. Gideon found himself facing consequences he had never imagined. Yet while his empire trembled under pressure, Mireille and her daughters were growing stronger each day in a world they had rebuilt from kindness, hard work, and hope. The girls once dismissed as burdens were becoming the very reason their mother's life now blossomed with purpose and resilience. Winter returned to the city with a quiet snowfall the evening Mireille unveiled her largest public garden installation. The space had once been a neglected glass pavilion in a municipal park, but under her careful design it had transformed into a breathtaking winter garden filled with evergreen arches, white lilies, and soft golden lights woven among climbing vines. Families walked slowly through the pathways admiring the beauty, children laughed beneath the glowing branches, and local newspapers quietly praised the woman who had restored life to the forgotten place. Cecily proudly showed visitors the section of the garden where her own drawings had inspired the layout, while little Odette toddled happily along the pathways, fascinated by the colors. Mireille stood at the entrance greeting guests with calm gratitude, her daughters beside her, feeling a quiet satisfaction that the life she had rebuilt now belonged entirely to her and the people she loved. Among the crowd that evening stood Gideon Rowe, watching from a distance where the soft lights of the pavilion reflected against the glass walls. He had not intended to come at first, but curiosity and a restless guilt had drawn him there. Seeing Mireille again after so long struck him harder than he expected. She looked stronger, calmer, and far more confident than the woman he had cast out months earlier. But what unsettled him most was watching Cecily and Odette move through the garden with joy and innocence. They had grown without him, laughing freely in a life he had chosen to abandon. Gideon felt something unfamiliar tightening in his chest as Cecily proudly explained one of the flower displays to another child, her voice bright with excitement. The daughters he once dismissed as burdens had become the heart of a beautiful world he could only observe from the outside. Later that evening Gideon tried reaching out to Mireille, approaching cautiously as the crowd began thinning. His words were hesitant, awkward, and far less confident than the commanding voice he used in boardrooms. Mireille listened quietly, though her expression remained calm and guarded. She thanked him politely for attending but made it clear that the life she was building no longer depended on his approval or involvement. Cecily, now old enough to remember the painful night they were forced to leave the mansion, stood beside her mother without stepping forward to greet him. The distance between them spoke louder than any argument. As Mireille walked away with her daughters beneath the glowing lights of the winter garden, Gideon remained behind the glass walls of the pavilion, realizing that the family he had once taken for granted had grown into something strong and beautiful without him. The months following the Winter Garden exhibition brought sweeping changes to the Rowe Empire. Investigations quietly launched by regulatory agencies and journalists began exposing irregularities in the company's old financial structures, many of which traced back to decisions Roland had made decades earlier. Felix Rowan, the journalist who had begun examining those records, published a carefully researched article that questioned the myth of flawless leadership surrounding the Rowe name. The report did not sensationalize the story, but it presented enough truth to unsettle investors and board members alike. Gideon suddenly found himself in meetings filled with doubt rather than admiration. Roland's declining health made it impossible for the aging patriarch to defend himself effectively, and the authority he once wielded over the family began dissolving. Brenna, unwilling to allow further deception, stepped forward to help restructure the company with full transparency, insisting that the business must survive through honesty rather than secrecy. While the Rowe legacy struggled to maintain stability, Mireille's life continued expanding in ways she once could never have imagined. Her landscaping and floral restoration projects had become highly respected across the city, drawing attention not because of wealth or publicity but because of the peace her designs brought to the spaces she touched. Schools invited her to teach children about plants and gardening, while community centers asked for her guidance in restoring neglected parks. Cecily flourished in this environment, becoming fascinated with drawing plants and trees, filling sketchbooks with imaginative designs that often inspired her mother's work. Little Odette grew fearless and lively, running through gardens with bright laughter that seemed to chase away every shadow of the past. Rowe and Beck remained a steady presence in their lives as well, offering quiet support and friendship as they worked together on several large greenhouse restoration projects. His calm nature and shared love of nature created a partnership built on mutual respect rather than urgency. One quiet afternoon, Mireille and her daughters planted a young flowering tree at the edge of a community park she had recently helped restore. Cecily carefully patted the soil around the roots while Odette watched with wide curiosity, holding a small watering can almost too large for her hands. Roland stood nearby with his son Nora, helping steady the tree while Mireille finished securing the soil. Across the park pathway, Gideon happened to pass by on his way from a tense business meeting. He stopped unnoticed among the trees, watching the simple scene unfold. The sight struck him deeply, his daughters laughing together, Mireille guiding them patiently, and the tree taking root in the ground as though it belonged there. In that quiet moment, Gideon understood something he had never truly grasped before. Legacy was not preserved through pride or inheritance papers, it lived in the people who carried kindness, courage, and life forward long after pride had faded. By early spring, the weight of Gideon's decisions had become impossible for him to ignore. The investigation surrounding the Rowe Company continued, forcing difficult conversations inside boardrooms that once welcomed him with admiration. Investors questioned past leadership choices, Roland's influence had diminished greatly due to illness, and Brenna's insistence on transparency reshaped the company's direction. Yet none of those professional troubles troubled Gideon as deeply as the emptiness that followed him home each night. The mansion that once symbolized power now echoed with silence. The rooms where Cecily used to laugh and where Odette had once cried as an infant now stood untouched, like quiet reminders of a life he had pushed away. The realization slowly settled over him that protecting a legacy built on pride had cost him something far more important, his family. Eventually, Gideon gathered the courage to visit Mireille again, not in the confident manner he once approached every situation but with a humility that felt unfamiliar even to him. He found her at the greenhouse where she and Rowan had been restoring rows of winter-damaged plants into vibrant color. Mireille listened calmly as Gideon spoke about his mistakes, the pressure he had allowed to control him, and the painful truth he had discovered about the Rowe family's history. He admitted openly that the beliefs he had defended were rooted in deception and pride. Mireille did not respond with anger or triumph. Instead, she spoke quietly but firmly about the night he forced her and the girls out into the cold. She reminded him that apologies, while meaningful, could never erase the fear and humiliation that moment had caused. Rowan stepped away respectfully, allowing the conversation to unfold without interference, while Cecily and Odette played nearby among the flowers. The most difficult moment came when Cecily approached her father with the honest curiosity only a child could express. She looked at Gideon carefully and asked the question that had lived in her heart since that painful night. "Why weren't we enough?" she asked softly, her eyes filled with confusion rather than anger. Gideon struggled to find words, realizing that no explanation could truly justify what he had done. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Mireille gently placed a reassuring hand on Cecily's shoulder, guiding her back toward the garden where Odette waited. As Gideon watched them walk away together, he understood that the greatest consequences of his choices were not financial losses or damaged reputation. The true reckoning lay in the trust he had broken and the love he had failed to protect. In that quiet moment, Gideon finally recognized that some lessons arrive too late to repair what has already been lost. Spring arrived fully the following year, bringing warmth, sunlight, and new blossoms across the gardens Mireille had helped restore throughout the city. Her work had grown into something larger than a small business, it had become a quiet movement of renewal. Parks once forgotten now carried vibrant flowers, schools built small learning gardens where children could understand nature, and community courtyards bloomed with life again. Mireille moved through these spaces with calm confidence, guiding projects, teaching volunteers, and reminding people that growth always began with patience. Cecily had become a thoughtful young girl who loved sketching plants and imagining entire landscapes, while little Odette followed her sister through the gardens with joyful curiosity. Their laughter often echoed through the greenhouse where Mireille and Rowan continued working side by side, transforming fragile seedlings into thriving life. Around them, many other lives had also changed. Tamsin's ceramic studio had expanded into a respected craft workshop where her handmade planters and designs accompanied many of Mireille's floral installations. June Mercer's boarding house had become a stable refuge for people rebuilding their lives, strengthened by legal protections Iris Hale helped secure. Brenna's leadership within the Rowe Company brought transparency and responsibility back to the organization, ensuring the business would survive through ethical reform rather than pride. Colette, finally free from years of silence, returned to playing the piano in small community gatherings, rediscovering the music she once believed lost forever. Gideon continued rebuilding his life with quiet reflection, accepting that some mistakes could not be undone. Though he remained distant from Mireille's world, he worked earnestly to become a better man than the one who had once let pride guide his decisions. One warm afternoon, Mireille and her daughters stood together in a wide garden field preparing to plant several rare flowering trees that would bloom years in the future. Cecily carefully held a young sapling while Mireille dug the soil and Odette poured water into the earth with determined enthusiasm. Rowan and Nora worked nearby, helping secure the roots so the trees would grow strong. As they finished planting the final sapling, Cecily looked up at her mother with thoughtful curiosity and asked if flowers remembered the harsh winters they survived. Mireille smiled gently and brushed the soil from her hands before answering. She told her daughter that flowers always remembered winter, but they still chose to bloom when spring returned. In that moment, the garden around them stood as living proof of a powerful truth: life, dignity, and love could grow again even after the coldest seasons, and the daughters once called burdens had become the brightest blossoms of all. Thank you for listening to Luxurious Tales. If this tale moved you, share it with someone, leave a comment, and let us know what you felt. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Until next time.